The morning I found the first set of tracks behind my grandfather's cabin in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State, I was 12 years old and convinced that Bigfoot was nothing more than a campfire story designed to scare children into staying close to their parents. That was November of 1985. I'm 52 years old now, and what I've learned in the 4 decades since that cold autumn morning has fundamentally altered everything I thought I understood about human history, about evolution, and about the creatures that have been watching us from the shadows of the oldest forests on Earth. This is the truth I've kept hidden for nearly 40 years, and it's time the world finally knew what really happened between our species and theirs. My name is Thomas Reardon. I was born in 1973 in a small logging town called Darrington, nestled in the foothills where the North Cascades begin their steep climb toward the Canadian border. My father worked at the Weyerhaeuser mill until it closed in '87, and my mother taught 3rd grade at the elementary school, where I learned to read and write and believe that the world operated according to predictable rules. My grandfather, Harold Reardon, was different. He'd lived alone in a cabin about 15 miles outside of town since my grandmother passed in '68, and he told stories that made the other adults in my family exchange uncomfortable glances across Thanksgiving dinner tables. Grandpa Harold claimed he'd been communicating with something in the forest for nearly 20 years by the time I was born. He never called it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. He called it the Old One, and he spoke about it the way you might speak about a difficult neighbor who'd lived next door for so long that you'd developed a grudging mutual respect. Most of my family dismissed him as eccentric, possibly senile, definitely spending too much time alone in those woods. But I was 12 years old, and 12-year-old boys are naturally inclined toward mysteries and monsters, and the possibility that adults might be wrong about everything. The tracks I found that morning were pressed into a thin layer of early snow that had fallen overnight. I'd gone outside to gather kindling for the wood stove because Grandpa Harold's arthritis made it difficult for him to bend down. And there they were, a line of impressions leading from the tree line toward the small creek that ran behind the property. Each print was at least 16 inches long, maybe 7 inches wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions and a heel that sank deeper than the front of the foot. The stride between them measured nearly 5 feet, and they followed a path that seemed deliberately chosen to avoid the few patches of exposed ground where tracks would have been more difficult to read. I stood there in my pajamas and rubber boots, my breath making clouds in the November air, and I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not fear, exactly, though fear was certainly part of it. What I felt was the sudden, visceral understanding that the world was larger and stranger than I'd been taught to believe. The tracks were real. They were right there in front of me, as undeniable as the cold numbing my fingers or the smell of wood smoke drifting from the cabin's chimney. Something had walked through my grandfather's property during the night, something massive and bipedal, something that shouldn't exist according to every biology textbook I'd ever read. I ran inside to get Grandpa Harold, expecting him to be as shocked as I was. Instead, he pulled on his heavy canvas coat, walked outside with me, and studied the tracks with the careful attention of someone examining familiar evidence. He nodded slowly, then looked toward the tree line where the tracks emerged from the forest. "He came close last night," Grandpa Harold said. "Closer than usual. He does that sometimes when the weather's about to turn bad. Checking on me, I think, making sure the old man hasn't fallen and broken his hip or run out of firewood." I asked my grandfather what he meant by checking on him, and that's when he told me the full story for the first time. Not the abbreviated version he'd shared at family gatherings, the one that made my parents roll their eyes and change the subject. The real story, the one that would eventually become my obsession, my life's work, and the reason I'm finally breaking my silence after all these years. Grandpa Harold had first encountered the old one in the summer of 1966, 2 years before my grandmother died. He'd been hiking alone in a remote valley about 8 miles from the cabin, looking for a good spot to set up a deer blind for the upcoming hunting season. The terrain was difficult, steep ridges and dense undergrowth that made progress slow and exhausting. Around mid-afternoon, he'd stopped to rest near a small waterfall that fed into a pool surrounded by moss-covered rocks. The forest was quiet that day, he told me. Too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, just the sound of the waterfall and his own breathing. He knew something was different about that silence, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. That's when he saw it for the first time. Standing on the opposite bank of the pool, maybe 40 feet away, was a creature that stood at least 8 feet tall and was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair. It had been drinking from the pool, cupping water in massive hands and bringing it to its mouth, and it froze when it noticed my grandfather watching. They stared at each other for what Grandpa Harold estimated was nearly 3 minutes. Neither of them moved. Neither of them made a sound. And in those 3 minutes, my grandfather said he understood something that changed the way he saw the world. The creature wasn't looking at him the way an animal looks at a potential threat or a source of food. It was looking at him the way one person looks at another, with recognition, with assessment, with what he could only describe as curiosity mixed with caution. There was intelligence in those eyes, he told me. Not animal intelligence, real intelligence. The kind that thinks about the past and worries about the future. The kind that recognizes another thinking being and wonders what it's going to do next. Eventually, the creature turned and walked into the forest. Not running, not panicking, just walking with a deliberate calm that suggested it had made a decision and was acting on it. My grandfather sat there by that pool for another hour, trying to process what he'd witnessed. When he finally made his way home, he didn't tell anyone except my grandmother, and she'd made him promise to keep it between them. People would think he'd lost his mind, she said. They'd stop trusting his judgment about anything else. And in a small town like Darrington, where everyone knew everyone, reputation was everything. But Grandpa Harold couldn't leave it alone. Over the following months, he returned to that valley again and again, hoping for another encounter. He found tracks several times, found places where something large had been sleeping in thickets of ferns, found trees with bark stripped away at heights that no bear could reach. He found fish bones near streams, the remains of meals eaten by something with a more sophisticated palate than any animal he knew. And then, nearly a year after that first sighting, he saw the creature again. This time was different. This time the creature didn't immediately leave when it noticed my grandfather. Instead, it sat down on a fallen log about 50 feet away and watched him with those same intelligent, assessing eyes. My grandfather, operating on instinct more than reason, sat down too. They remained like that, watching each other for nearly an hour before the creature stood and disappeared into the trees. It felt like a test, my grandfather said, like it was deciding whether I was dangerous or just curious, like it was giving me a chance to prove what kind of person I was. Over the next 19 years, until my grandmother's death, my grandfather and the creature developed what he called an understanding. He would visit that valley every few weeks, and more often than not, the creature would appear. They never got closer than about 30 feet from each other during those early years. But there was communication happening, Grandpa Harold insisted. The creature would vocalize low sounds that seemed to carry meaning. It would make gestures pointing at things, indicating directions. And slowly, over years of patient observation, my grandfather began to understand. When my grandmother died in '68, Grandpa Harold's relationship with the creature changed dramatically. He started spending more time in the forest, sometimes days at a stretch, and the creature seemed to sense his grief. it began appearing closer to the cabin, leaving offerings. Near the tree line, a freshly caught salmon, a bundle of medicinal herbs that my grandfather later identified as having legitimate therapeutic properties. Once, a collection of obsidian shards that looked like they'd been deliberately shaped, as if the creature was sharing examples of craftsmanship or demonstrating skills that no mere animal could possess. By the time I was born in '73, my grandfather and the old one had established a genuine relationship. The creature would come to the edge of the property on nights when the moon was dark, and my grandfather would leave food and small gifts. They had developed a vocabulary of sounds and gestures that allowed basic communication. And according to my grandfather, the creature had begun to share information slowly and carefully about its kind and their history. That first morning when I discovered the tracks, my grandfather decided I was old enough to know the truth. He told me everything he'd learned over nearly 2 decades of contact, and what he revealed was so extraordinary that I struggled to accept it even as I stared at the physical evidence melting in the November sunshine. According to what the old one had communicated, its kind had been living in the deep forests of North America for far longer than modern humans had been on the continent. They weren't animals in any conventional sense. They had language, culture, history, and social structures that stretched back tens of thousands of years. They had watched the first humans cross from Asia during the Ice Ages. They had observed the rise and spread of indigenous peoples across the Americas, and they had made a collective decision long before European colonization to remain hidden. They called themselves by a name that roughly translated to the forest people. Though my grandfather said the actual sounds were impossible for a human throat to reproduce accurately, the reason for that decision, my grandfather said, was rooted in something that happened so long ago that even the old one only knew it through oral traditions passed down across countless generations. Something terrible had occurred between their kind and early humans, something that taught them we couldn't be trusted. And so they had retreated into the most remote wilderness areas, developed techniques for avoiding detection, and watched from the shadows as human civilization spread across the planet. I was 12 years old, and I believed every word, not because I was gullible, but because of those tracks in the snow, because of the look in my grandfather's eyes when he spoke, and because somewhere deep in my bones I recognized the truth of what he was telling me. The world was not what I'd been taught. There were mysteries older than history, beings who had been watching humanity's entire existence unfold, and one of them had chosen to communicate with my grandfather. That November weekend changed the trajectory of my life. I became obsessed with learning. Everything I could about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and similar creatures reported across cultures worldwide. I read every book I could find, from serious anthropological studies to the most sensationalist tabloid accounts. I learned to distinguish between obvious hoaxes and credible reports, between wishful thinking and genuine evidence. And every chance I got, I visited my grandfather's cabin, hoping for my own encounter with the old one. It took 3 years before that encounter finally happened. I was 15 years old, visiting during spring break of 1988, when my grandfather told me the old one had agreed to meet me. He'd been negotiating for months, he said, explaining that I could be trusted, that I was family, that I understood the importance of keeping secrets. The creature had been hesitant. It had only revealed itself to my grandfather because of unusual circumstances, because of their years of gradual relationship building. Showing itself to a human child was a significant risk, but eventually it agreed. And on a cool April evening, as the sun was setting behind the mountains and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I saw the old one for the first time. We walked together into the forest, my grandfather and I, following a path I'd traveled dozens of times on previous visits. About a mile from the cabin, in a small clearing surrounded by ancient Douglas firs, my grandfather stopped and made a series of sounds I didn't recognize. Low vocalizations, almost like humming, but with rhythm and variation that suggested meaning. He waited, and after perhaps 5 minutes, something emerged from the shadows between the trees. I've spent nearly 40 years trying to find words adequate to describe that moment. The creature stood approximately 8 feet tall, maybe 8.5. Its body was covered in thick hair that ranged from dark brown to reddish auburn, longer around the shoulders and head, shorter on the chest and stomach. The shoulders were impossibly broad, probably 4 feet across, and the arms were long and heavily muscled, ending in hands that looked capable of crushing stone. The legs were shorter in proportion to the body than a human's would be, but massively thick and powerful. But it was the face that held me transfixed. Not quite human, not quite ape, something uniquely its own. A heavy brow ridge shaded deep-set eyes that were dark brown and filled with an intelligence that was immediately, undeniably apparent. The nose was broad and flat, the jaw pronounced but not protruding. And when it looked at me, when those ancient eyes met mine, I felt something shift inside my chest. I was standing in the presence of a thinking, feeling, reasoning being that was fundamentally different from every other creature I'd ever encountered, and yet somehow, impossibly, I recognized it as a person. The old one studied me for what felt like an eternity. Then it turned to my grandfather and made a series of sounds, soft and low, that seemed to carry complex meaning. My grandfather responded in kind, and they exchanged vocalizations for perhaps a minute before my grandfather turned to me. He says, "You have your grandmother's eyes," my grandfather said quietly. He remembers her. He was sorry when she passed. He says loss is something his kind understands well. I didn't know what to say. I was 15 years old, standing in a forest clearing at dusk, being told that a creature from legend had known and remembered my grandmother. The world I'd grown up in, the world of homework and high school and teenage anxieties, seemed very far away. The old one took a step closer, and I forced myself not to retreat. Up close, I could smell it, a musky, earthy scent that wasn't unpleasant but was completely unlike anything I'd ever encountered. It reached out one massive hand, moving slowly, deliberately, and touched my shoulder with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the raw power evident in every aspect of its form. Then it spoke. Not the vocalizations it had exchanged with my grandfather, but something else. Words. English words, rough and oddly accented, but unmistakable. "You are welcome here," it said. Its voice was deep, resonant, like something emerging from a cave. "You carry the blood of one who earned trust. Do not betray what is given." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. A creature that science said didn't exist had just spoken to me in my own language, had touched my shoulder, had acknowledged my family connection to the man who had spent 2 decades building a relationship with it. The old one watched my reaction with what might have been amusement, though reading expressions on that alien face was difficult. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows with a silence that seemed impossible for something so large. My grandfather put his hand on my shoulder, the same shoulder the creature had touched, and we stood there together as darkness gathered around the clearing. "Now you understand," he said. "Now you know why I couldn't tell anyone, why I had to keep this secret all these years. This is bigger than us, Thomas, bigger than anything you can imagine, and now it's partly your responsibility too." That night, back at the cabin, my grandfather told me more about what he'd learned from the old one over their years of communication. The creature had been teaching him, slowly and carefully, about the history of its kind. And what my grandfather had pieced together was so extraordinary, so paradigm-shattering, that he'd never dared share it with anyone except my grandmother. According to the Old One, its species had been present in North America for at least 50,000 years, possibly longer. They had evolved separately from humans, but were related distant cousins on the evolutionary tree who had diverged hundreds of thousands of years ago. Their ancestors had crossed into the Americas long before the first human migrations, when land bridges and different climate conditions made such movement possible. They had thrived in the vast forests that once covered most of the continent, developing their own form of civilization that left no trace on the landscape because they had learned to live within the natural world rather than transforming it. But here was the part that would haunt me for years, the revelation that would eventually drive me to spend my adult life investigating what I'd been told. The Old One's kind hadn't just been passive observers of human history. At certain points, in certain places, they had interacted directly with our species. They had influenced early human development. They had taught certain skills, shared certain knowledge, guided certain migrations. Many of the great leaps forward in early human civilization, my grandfather said the Old One had implied, were not independent discoveries but lessons passed from one intelligent species to another. And then, thousands of years ago, something had gone terribly wrong. An event so catastrophic that it had convinced the Old One's kind that coexistence with humans was impossible. They had withdrawn completely, becoming myths and legends, watching from the forests as human civilization rose and spread and eventually began to threaten the very wilderness that sheltered them. What happened? I asked my grandfather. What went wrong between them and us? My grandfather shook his head slowly. He won't tell me everything. Some things, he says, are too painful to remember even after all this time. But Thomas, he looked at me with eyes that held decades of accumulated knowledge and sorrow. What I've been able to piece together suggests it was something we did. Something terrible. Something that convinced them we were too dangerous, too unpredictable, too willing to destroy what we don't understand. I spent the rest of that week at my grandfather's cabin, and I saw the Old One 2 more times. Each encounter was brief, lasting perhaps 15 or 20 minutes, but each one deepened my understanding of what I was dealing with. This wasn't an animal. This was a person, as intelligent and emotionally complex as any human I'd ever met, but carrying the weight of a history that stretched back before our species had developed writing or agriculture or civilization. When I returned home to Darrington, I couldn't tell anyone what I'd experienced. My parents would have thought I'd lost my mind, or worse, that my grandfather's eccentricities had finally infected me. My friends would have laughed or spread rumors. So I kept the secret just as my grandfather had kept it for more than 2 decades, and I began planning my life around the knowledge I now possessed. I went to college at the University of Washington in 1991, majoring in anthropology with a minor in linguistics. I chose those fields specifically because they seemed most relevant to understanding what the Old One had told us, if its kind had truly interacted with early humans. There might be evidence in the archaeological record, in the linguistic patterns of indigenous languages, in the mythologies and oral traditions preserved by cultures worldwide. Throughout college, I visited my grandfather's cabin as often as I could, usually once a month during the academic year, and for extended periods during breaks. My relationship with the Old One deepened during those years. I learned to understand more of its vocalizations, to read the subtle expressions on its alien face, to communicate in a pidgin of sounds and gestures and occasional English words that allowed increasingly complex exchanges. And the Old One, perhaps sensing my genuine interest and respect, began to share more of what it knew. Not everything, never everything, but fragments and pieces that I recorded meticulously in journals I kept hidden in a locked box in my dorm room. In the spring of 1993, during my junior year, my grandfather called me with news that would accelerate everything. He was sick, cancer, the doctor said, inoperable. He had perhaps 6 months to live, maybe less. I drove to the cabin the same day, skipping classes that suddenly seemed irrelevant, and found my grandfather sitting on his porch, looking out at the forest he'd loved for so many years. "The old one knows," he told me. "He came last night, stayed longer than usual. I think he understands what's happening. They live a long time, Thomas, much longer than us. He's seen many humans come and go, but he said something interesting before he left." What did he say? My grandfather looked at me with eyes that were already beginning to show the toll of his illness. He said the bond passes. He said you are now the one he will trust. And he said that when I'm gone, he will decide whether to tell you the full truth about what happened between his kind and ours. The truth that even I don't fully know. My grandfather died on September 14th, 1993. I was there at the end, holding his hand in the hospital room in Everett, where he'd been transferred when the pain became too great to manage at home. His last words to me were about the old one. "Don't let it end," he whispered. "Don't let what I learned die with me. The world needs to know eventually, when the time is right, when people are ready. Promise me, Thomas." I promised, and I meant it with everything I had. After the funeral, after the family gathered and dispersed, and my parents argued about what to do with the cabin, I drove up into the mountains alone. The property had been left to me in my grandfather's will, a decision that surprised everyone except me. I parked in front of the cabin as the sun was setting, and I walked into the forest following the path I'd traveled so many times with my grandfather. The old one was waiting in the clearing. It had never done that before, never been there before I arrived. But it stood in the fading light, its massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky, and I understood that this was a new beginning. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, uncertain of protocol, unsure whether the relationship my grandfather had built would transfer to me or whether I would need to start from nothing. The old one resolved my uncertainty by speaking first. "Harold walked beyond," it said in that deep, resonant voice. "He was good. He understood. You are his blood. You will continue." "I will," I said, finding my voice. "I promised him." The old one nodded, a gesture it had learned from observing humans over God knows how many years. Then it said something that made my breath catch. He asked me to tell you the truth, the full truth. What happened long ago. Why we hide, why we watch, why we fear your kind even as we recognize that some of you can be trusted. He said you were ready. He said you would understand. "I am ready," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was true. The old one studied me for a long moment, those ancient eyes weighing my words, measuring my character. Then it sat down on the same fallen log where my grandfather had sat during their early encounters. 27 years of history in that simple gesture, and it began to speak. What I learned over the following hours and over the months and years that followed, as the old one shared more and more of its people's history, was so profound that I've spent 3 decades trying to verify, contextualize, and prepare for the eventual revelation. What I'm about to tell you is the reason I've finally decided to break my silence, the knowledge that has haunted me for 40 years, the truth about humanity's past that explains why these creatures have stayed hidden while watching our species nearly destroy itself over and over again. The old one's kind, the species that humans have called Bigfoot and Sasquatch, and 100 other names across dozens of cultures, are not simply undiscovered animals. They are our closest relatives, a parallel branch of intelligent life that evolved alongside humanity but chose a different path. Their intelligence rivals our own. Their history stretches back further than ours. and they have memories passed down through generations of oral tradition, of a time when our two species lived together, worked together, and nearly destroyed each other. The reason they chose that path, the reason they retreated from contact with our ancestors and have remained hidden ever since, is because of what happened approximately 12,000 years ago in a region that would eventually become known as the Pacific Northwest. The Old One called it the Great Betrayal, and what it described was nothing less than genocide. 12,000 years ago, the Old One told me, the world was a different place. The great ice sheets that had covered much of North America were retreating, opening new territories for both human and forest people expansion. The climate was warming, forests were spreading, and the two intelligent species that shared this continent had developed a relationship that went far beyond simple coexistence. They had become partners, allies, and in some cases, something closer to family. The forest people, as I will call them from this point forward, since that is the closest translation of what they call themselves, had been in the Americas for tens of thousands of years before the first humans arrived. They had watched the earliest human migrations cross the land bridge from Asia, small bands of hunters following game into a new world. And unlike the natural wariness that governed their interactions with other species, the forest people recognized something in these newcomers. They recognized intelligence. They recognized potential. And they made a decision that would shape the history of both species. They decided to help. The Old One's account of what followed was detailed and specific, passed down through hundreds of generations of oral tradition, with a precision that seemed impossible until I understood how their memory worked. The forest people don't forget. Their elders can recite histories stretching back thousands of years, word for word, detail for detail, because their culture developed techniques for preserving information that human societies never achieved. What the Old One told me that night in the clearing, and over the many nights that followed, was not legend or mythology. It was history, preserved with a fidelity that puts our written records to shame. In those early years, the forest people taught the first Americans how to survive in this new land. They showed them which plants were edible and which were poisonous. They demonstrated hunting techniques adapted to the specific animals of the region. They shared knowledge of seasonal patterns, migration routes, and the subtle signs that predicted weather changes. The humans learned quickly, as humans always do, and within a few generations they had spread across vast territories, thriving in environments that should have killed them. But the forest people gave more than survival skills. They shared deeper knowledge, things that the Old One described with words I struggled to translate, concepts about the relationship between living things and the land they inhabited, understanding of cycles and patterns that connected everything from the smallest insect to the largest tree, what we might call ecology or systems thinking, but expressed in ways that were simultaneously more practical and more spiritual than anything in modern science. The relationship between the two species grew closer over centuries. In some regions, human and forest people communities lived in proximity, trading goods and knowledge, celebrating seasonal events together, forming bonds that crossed the species barrier. The Old One told me about ancestors who had human friends, who attended human ceremonies, who mourned when human companions died. There were even, the Old One said, with what might have been embarrassment, romantic attachments between individuals of the two species. Not common, but not unknown. The genetic distance was too great for offspring, but love, apparently, doesn't care about such limitations. This period of cooperation lasted for thousands of years. The human population grew slowly, limited by the carrying capacity of the land and by cultural practices that the forest people had helped instill. There was conflict sometimes, as there always is between groups, but nothing that threatened the fundamental partnership. Both species benefited from the arrangement. Humans gained knowledge and occasional assistance from their larger, stronger neighbors. The forest people gained companions who could go places and do things that their size and need for secrecy made difficult. Then everything changed. Around 12,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries, a new wave of humans began arriving in the Pacific Northwest. They came from the south, the Old One said, from regions where the forest people had never been numerous and where humans had developed differently. These newcomers were not like the bands the forest people had been working with for millennia. They were more numerous, more aggressive, and they brought with them ideas and practices that horrified the forest people who encountered them. The newcomers believed that the land existed to be dominated. They cleared forests for agriculture on a scale the region had never seen. They hunted not just for sustenance but for sport and trade, decimating animal populations that had remained stable for thousands of years. And when they encountered the forest people, they didn't see potential partners or teachers. They saw monsters to be destroyed. The first attacks were isolated incidents. A forest people individual killed while foraging too close to a new human settlement. A family group ambushed while sleeping in a territory they had inhabited for generations. The original human allies of the forest people were caught in the middle, pressured by the newcomers to prove their loyalty by participating in the violence or face being treated as enemies themselves. Some resisted. The Old One spoke of human heroes, individuals, and entire communities who stood with the forest people against the expansion, who tried to broker peace, who hid forest people families from hunting parties and warned them of planned attacks. But the newcomers were too numerous, too organized, and too determined. One by one, the resistant human communities were absorbed, destroyed, or forced to flee into ever more remote territories. The forest people tried to adapt. They retreated from their most vulnerable territories, consolidating in the deepest forests and highest mountains. They changed their behavior, becoming more nocturnal, more secretive, developing techniques for avoiding detection that they had never needed before. They tried to negotiate, to find some accommodation with the newcomers. But every attempt at communication was met with violence. The newcomers had decided that the forest people were animals, and nothing could convince them otherwise. What happened next, the Old One said, was the moment that changed everything. The moment that transformed a conflict into a genocide and convinced the forest people that humans could never be trusted again. The newcomers discovered the locations of several major forest people gathering places. These were sites of tremendous cultural and spiritual significance, places where the forest people had been meeting for thousands of years to share knowledge, arrange partnerships, settle disputes, and celebrate their existence as a species. The newcomers learned of these locations from captured forest people who were tortured for information, and from former human allies who broke under pressure and revealed what they knew. The attacks were coordinated on a single night as the forest people gathered for a seasonal ceremony that brought together communities from across the region. The newcomers struck. They came with fire and weapons, attacking multiple sites simultaneously so that no warning could spread. The Old One's voice changed as it described what happened, becoming lower and rougher, and I understood that even after 12,000 years, the pain of this memory was fresh. Thousands of forest people died that night. Entire family lines were exterminated. Knowledge holders who carried the accumulated wisdom of millennia were killed before they could pass on what they knew. The attacks specifically targeted elders and children, the most vulnerable members of the communities, ensuring that the damage would echo across generations. But what made the Great Betrayal truly unforgivable, what convinced the survivors that coexistence with humans was impossible, was the role played by their former allies. Humans they had known for generations, Humans they had taught and helped and trusted participated in the attacks. Some did so under coercion, threatened with death if they refused. But others participated willingly, eager to prove their loyalty to the newcomers by demonstrating their rejection of everything they had once valued. The old one told me about watching a human it had known since childhood, someone it had taught to track deer and identify medicinal plants, someone it had considered a friend, leading attackers to a hidden shelter where forest people families had taken refuge. The human knew the secret paths, knew the signs that marked safe passages, knew exactly where to find the people who had trusted him, and he used that knowledge to help the newcomers kill them. That, the old one said, was when we understood. It doesn't matter how many generations of trust you build. It doesn't matter how much you give or how much you help. Humans are capable of betrayal on a scale that we cannot comprehend. Your species can turn on those who love you with a completeness that has no parallel in our experience. And if humans who knew us, who had grown up alongside us, who called us friends and teachers, could do what they did that night, then no human could ever be trusted again. The survivors retreated into the deepest wilderness. They developed new rules for their society, rules that have governed them ever since. No contact with humans except in the most extraordinary circumstances. No revealing themselves under any conditions. Watch from the shadows, learn what the humans are doing, but never engage. And pass down the memory of the great betrayal to every generation so that no one ever forgets why these rules exist. I sat in that clearing, listening to the old one's account, and I felt something I had never experienced before. Shame. Not personal guilt exactly, because I hadn't committed these acts and couldn't have prevented them, but a deep, bone-level shame for my species, for what we were capable of, for the destruction we had wrought against beings who had only tried to help us. The old one watched my reaction with those ancient, unreadable eyes. When I finally spoke, my voice was barely a whisper. Why did you tell my grandfather? Why did you trust him after all of that? The old one was silent for a long moment. When it spoke, its voice was softer than I had ever heard it. Because he was different, it said. Harold came into the forest with respect. He watched without demanding. He offered without expecting. For years, he proved himself through patience and humility. And when we finally met, when I looked into his eyes, I saw something I had not seen in a human in thousands of years. I saw recognition. He understood that we were people, not animals, not monsters, not spirits, people. Different from humans, but equally real, equally deserving of dignity and consideration. That understanding is so rare among your kind that when we find it, we cannot help but respond. And me? I asked. Why trust me? You carry Harold's gift, the old one said. The ability to see what is actually there instead of what you expect to see. It is rare. It may be inherited, or it may be learned, or it may be some combination of both, but you have it. I watched you grow from a child into a man, and I saw that the gift did not fade as it does in most humans. You maintained your capacity for wonder, your willingness to question your assumptions, your respect for things you do not understand. These qualities made Harold worthy of trust. They make you worthy as well. But I need you to understand something, Thomas. The old one leaned forward, and even though I had been meeting with this creature for years, the sheer physical presence of it still made my heart race. What I have told you tonight, what I will continue to tell you if you wish to learn, cannot be shared. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Your species is not ready. The same capacity for betrayal that drove our ancestors apart 12,000 years ago still exists in humans today. We see it constantly. Wars, genocides, environmental destruction, the systematic elimination of anything that stands in the way of human expansion. If the world knew we existed, if they knew the truth about what happened between our species, they would come for us again. And this time, there are so many more of them and so few of us. We would not survive. I understood. I hated it, but I understood. The forest people had every reason to distrust humanity. We had earned that distrust through actions so horrific that even the passage of millennia hadn't healed the wound. And nothing I could say or do would change that fundamental reality. But there was something else the Old One said that night. Something that would shape the next 30 years of my life and eventually lead me to the decision I'm making now. The time may come, it said, when the truth must be revealed. We watch your species carefully. We see the paths you are walking, the destruction you are causing, the ways you are changing the world. Some of my people believe that humans will destroy themselves before they become a threat to us. Others believe that the destruction humans are causing will eventually threaten everything, including the deep forests where we have hidden for so long. If that happens, if the choice becomes hiding and dying or revealing ourselves and fighting for survival, we may need humans who understand, humans who can speak for us, humans who can explain why we exist and why we matter and why the crimes of 12,000 years ago should not be repeated. Harold was preparing for that possibility. Now the preparation falls to you. Over the following years, I learned everything the Old One was willing to teach me. The full history of the forest people, stretching back tens of thousands of years. Their language, at least the parts of it that human vocal cords can approximate. Their understanding of the natural world, accumulated over more generations than I could count. Their philosophy, their values, their hopes and fears. I filled journal after journal with notes, carefully hidden and encoded so that no one who found them could understand what they contained. I also learned about the present-day forest people, the communities that still exist in the most remote wilderness areas of North America. The Old One introduced me to others of its kind, slowly and carefully, and I came to understand that I was being vetted by an entire society. Not everyone approved of the Old One's decision to trust a human. Some argued that the risk was too great, that even a well-intentioned human could inadvertently reveal their existence. But the Old One had standing in its community, earned over a long lifetime of wisdom and service, and its judgment was ultimately respected. I learned that the forest people number perhaps a few thousand individuals scattered across the continent. They live in family groups of 5 to 20, maintaining territories in the deepest wilderness areas and communicating with other groups through a network of signal sites and occasional physical meetings. They are intelligent enough to understand the modern world, to observe human technology and society from a distance, to adapt their concealment strategies as human surveillance capabilities improved. They know about satellites and trail cameras and DNA analysis. They know that discovery becomes more likely every year, and they are preparing in their own way for the day when hiding is no longer possible. My professional life became a cover story for my real work. I completed my degree in anthropology, earned a doctorate, and eventually secured a position at a university where I could pursue research that aligned with my secret mission. I studied indigenous mythologies, particularly the stories about wild men of the woods that appear in cultures throughout the Americas. I analyzed linguistic patterns that suggested contact between human groups and non-human intelligences. I investigated archaeological sites that seemed to show evidence of cooperation between different species. Everything I published was carefully calibrated to advance knowledge without revealing too much, to lay groundwork that might eventually support the revelation I was preparing for. I married twice. Both marriages ended in divorce, not because of anything wrong with my wives, but because I couldn't share the most important part of my life with them. I have 2 children, now adults, who think their father is an eccentric academic with an unusual interest in Bigfoot folklore. I've missed holidays and birthdays and graduations because the old one asked me to come to the forest. I've sacrificed relationships and opportunities and aspects of normal human existence because I believed that what I was doing mattered more than personal happiness. And now, at 52 years old, I've decided that the time has come to begin sharing what I know. The decision wasn't mine alone. 3 years ago, the old one told me that the forest people had been holding discussions about their future. The signs they monitor suggested that environmental destruction was accelerating, that the wilderness areas they depend on were shrinking faster than at any point in their recorded history. Climate change was altering the forests in ways that made their traditional ways of life increasingly difficult. Human encroachment was reaching places that had been safe for thousands of years. The strategy of hiding and waiting was reaching its limits. Some of the forest people argued for a dramatic revelation, for stepping into the open and forcing humanity to acknowledge their existence. They believed that the shock of discovery might generate enough sympathy and interest to protect them, that humans had changed enough over the millennia that the great betrayal would not repeat itself. Others argued for the opposite extreme, for retreating even further, for abandoning the last relatively accessible territories and withdrawing to the most extreme, environments where human presence was practically impossible. The old one advocated for a middle path. Begin sharing information through trusted humans. Let the knowledge spread slowly, building awareness and acceptance before any physical revelation. Test how modern humans respond to the idea of another intelligent species and use that response to gauge whether a fuller revelation would be safe. It was a cautious approach, but caution had served the forest people well for 12,000 years. I was chosen to begin this process, not because I'm special, but because I've been preparing for 30 years, because I have credibility in the academic world that might help the information be taken seriously, and because the old one vouches for me in ways that carry weight with the forest people's leadership. What I'm telling you now is the first step, a story presented as a story, deniable if necessary, but containing truths that those who are ready will recognize. I don't expect most people who hear this to believe it. I don't even need most people to believe it. I just need some people to start asking questions, to look at the evidence with new eyes, to consider possibilities that mainstream science has dismissed. Because here's what I've learned in 40 years of knowing the truth. The evidence is there if you know how to look for it. The consistent eyewitness reports from credible observers across centuries, the footprint casts that show anatomical details no hoaxer would know to include, the audio recordings of vocalizations that don't match any known animal, the thermal imaging footage that shows heat signatures consistent with large primates in areas where no such animals are supposed to exist, the indigenous oral traditions that describe the same beings with remarkable consistency across cultures that had no contact with each other. Science has dismissed all of this evidence because it doesn't fit existing paradigms. But that's exactly what science does with anomalies that challenge fundamental assumptions. It happened with continental drift, with bacterial causes of ulcers, with countless other discoveries that were ridiculed before they were accepted. The existence of the forest people is the same kind of paradigm-shifting truth. It's not that the evidence doesn't exist, it's that we've been trained not to see it. I'm asking you to consider seeing it, to approach the question of whether humans share this planet with another intelligent species, not as believers or skeptics, but as investigators willing to follow evidence wherever it leads. To understand that the absence of a specimen in a museum doesn't mean the absence of the creature in the forest. To recognize that beings intelligent enough to avoid detection for 12,000 years would also be intelligent enough to continue avoiding detection today. And most importantly, I'm asking you to consider what it would mean if I'm telling the truth. What it would mean for our understanding of human history, of evolution, of our place in the natural world. What obligations we might have to beings who helped our ancestors survive, and who we repaid with attempted extermination. What choices we would face as a society if we had to acknowledge that we are not the only intelligent species on this planet, and that our relationship with the other one began with a genocide we have completely forgotten. The old one is still alive, still living in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, in territories it has inhabited for longer than human civilization has existed, still watching, still waiting, still hoping that somehow, despite everything that happened, humanity might prove worthy of a second chance. I visit regularly, following protocols developed over decades to ensure that no one tracks me, that no technology betrays the locations of the forest people I've come to know. Last month, during my most recent visit, the old one asked me if I was ready. I said yes. It nodded, that learned gesture, and spoke words I will remember for the rest of my life. Tell them, it said. Tell them we exist. Tell them what happened. Tell them we remember, and tell them that we are watching to see what they do with this knowledge, whether they respond with fear and hatred or with recognition and respect, whether the humans of today are the same as the humans who betrayed us, or whether your species has grown enough to imagine a different future. We have been waiting 12,000 years for an answer. Perhaps it is time to find out what that answer is. I am Thomas Reardon. I was born in 1973 in a small logging town in Washington State. I have been keeping a secret for 40 years, a secret about the true history of humanity and the intelligent species we share this continent with. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to investigate for yourselves, to look at the evidence with open minds, to consider possibilities that the mainstream dismisses without examination. The forest people are real. They remember what we did to them, and they are waiting to see what we do next. This is my testimony. This is my truth. What you do with it is up to you. But before I close, let me share one final thing, something that happened just 2 months ago that convinced me the time for silence had truly passed. I was at the cabin, as I am most weekends now that I've reduced my academic responsibilities. It was late September, the leaves just beginning to turn, and I was sitting on the same porch where my grandfather had sat when he first told me about the old one. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that reminded me of that first evening when I saw the creature with my own eyes, 37 years ago. The old one emerged from the tree line, but it wasn't alone. Walking beside it was a younger forest person, smaller, maybe 7 feet tall, with lighter colored hair and eyes that held curiosity rather than the caution I was used to seeing. This was, I realized with a start, the first young forest person I had ever been allowed to meet. The old one introduced the younger one as its grandchild. A term I understood was not quite accurate, but the closest translation available. The young one had been watching me for years, observing from distances I never detected, learning about the human who visited the old one so regularly. And now, with the decision made to begin sharing information with the outside world, the young one had asked to meet me directly. We sat together as darkness gathered, 3 beings from 2 species, and the young one asked me questions about the human world. What were cities like? How did our communication devices work? Why did humans destroy forests when forests provided everything needed for life? The questions came with an intensity that reminded me of my own childhood curiosity, and I realized that I was looking at the future. This young forest person would live for perhaps 200 more years based on what the old one had told me about their lifespans. This individual would still be alive in the 23rd century, would witness changes to the world that I couldn't begin to imagine. What kind of world would it inherit? Would the forests that sustained its people still exist? Would the strategy of hiding still be viable? Or would environmental destruction and technological surveillance eventually make concealment impossible? Would the young one live to see its people revealed to the world? And if so, would that revelation bring recognition or destruction? The old one watched us talk, and when the young one eventually departed back into the forest, it turned to me with an expression I had learned to recognize as profound emotion. "That is why I chose to trust Harold," it said. "That is why I chose to trust you. Because whatever happens, the next generations deserve a chance. They deserve to know that some humans understood, that some humans tried, that the friendship between our peoples broken so long ago was not entirely forgotten. If the worst happens, if my people are discovered and hunted again, at least they will know that they were not alone, that there were humans who stood with them, who spoke for them, who remembered the old partnership even when the rest of your species had forgotten." I thought about my own grandchildren, the ones I might have someday if my children decide to have families. I thought about what kind of world they would inherit, what stories they would be told, what truths they would learn about human history and human nature. And I understood, perhaps for the first time fully, why I had spent 40 years keeping this secret and why I was finally choosing to share it. Because some truths are too important to die with the people who carry them, because the world needs to know that we are not alone, that we never were, that another form of intelligent life has been watching our species since before we had writing or cities or any of the things we call civilization. Because the story of the Great Betrayal is ultimately a story about us, about human nature, about our capacity for both partnership and destruction. And we need to understand that story if we're ever going to make different choices. The forest people are not monsters. They are not missing links or evolutionary dead ends or figments of overactive imaginations. They are people as real and as complex as any human, with histories and cultures and hopes and fears that deserve recognition and respect. They have been our neighbors for thousands of years, and we have forgotten them entirely, erased them from our understanding of the world so completely that most humans dismiss the very idea of their existence as absurd. But they remember us. They remember everything. And now, through me, they are giving humanity a chance to remember them. What we do with that chance will determine whether the next chapter of the relationship between our species is one of healing or one of tragedy. I've made my choice. I've chosen to speak, to share what I know, to trust that there are enough humans capable of the recognition and respect that the old one saw in my grandfather. I hope that trust is not misplaced. I hope that the young forest person I met 2 months ago will live to see a world where its people can exist openly, without fear, acknowledged and protected by the same humanity that once tried to destroy them. I hope that the Great Betrayal was an aberration, not a revelation of our fundamental nature, but hope is not enough. Action is required. Investigation is required. The willingness to look beyond comfortable assumptions and consider uncomfortable possibilities is required. And most of all, the recognition that we might not be the only intelligent species on this planet, and that the others might have very good reasons for hiding from us, is required. I have done what I can. I have kept my promise to my grandfather. I have honored the trust the old one placed in me. The rest is up to you. Go into the forests. Look for the signs. Learn the patterns that don't fit your expectations. And if you're very lucky, if you approach with the right combination of patience and respect and genuine curiosity, you might see something that changes everything you thought you knew about the world. They're out there. They've always been out there. And they're watching to see what we'll do next. My name is Thomas Reardon. I have been meeting Bigfoot since 1985, and now you know what it revealed about humanity's past. The question is whether that knowledge terrifies you or whether it inspires you to imagine a different future.